All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is September the 27th. Besides the fact that we're recording twice in 2 days, we've got a real special treat for our listeners this week.
We do. Look at us. We're both just grinning ear to ear. We're so excited for this one. So we have been super fortunate to have a lot of great guests over the course of this podcast that we've been doing for a little while now. But I'm not sure that we have been more excited or more grateful to have the guests that we're having on tonight. So we're having Steve Kornacki from NBC Politics, NBC News. You probably have seen him running along the maps on election night, election week, election month over the past few years, and he has graciously offered to spend some time with us tonight. We are now exactly 6 weeks out from the midterm elections, and Steve's going to break down. He's going to talk to us about some general trends that he is seeing, and then get into some more specific races in the Senate, and then make maybe a prediction or two about what he thinks is going to happen on election night in 6 weeks.
Yeah. I think, Brendan will, of course, give him a little bit of an introduction when he hops on, but I always think of him as the master at the telestrator. Nobody runs that like he does.
Right. He's like, like when John Madden like pioneered that on like football, like for me it was Fox. I know he was at somewhere before Fox, where he would do all these things and it was like, oh my goodness, this is like unprecedented level of analysis. That's like Steve, like politically.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So we're going to get right into that interview, but before we do, just a reminder that this podcast is brought to you by the hardworking craftsmen over at Cannon Hill Woodworking. They've been building handcrafted, high-end custom tables and desks in Boston since 2018. You can check them out on Instagram or visit them online at www.cannonhillwood.com. Remember, that's Cannon with two N's, Ricky. And Ricky, this podcast is going to be all about analyzing Democrats versus Republicans and who's going to win. But I would think one thing that we can all agree on is that supporting local, hardworking craftsmen who are making real high-end quality products is a good thing.
No argument here.
All right, so if you're looking for a piece of furniture or anything like that, check out Cannon Hill Wood and let them know we sent you. But without further ado, let's get in and talk to Steve. All right, so we are now thrilled to welcome Steve Kornacki to the show. Steve is someone who grew up in Massachusetts, like Ricky and I, grew up in Groton, Mass, was a Boston University graduate. He then went on to begin his journalism career as a reporter for politicsnj.com back in 2002 to 2006. He's also the former politics editor at Salon. He's had articles published in a bunch of different places, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. From 2012 to 2014, he hosted a couple of shows on MSNBC, including The Cycle and Up. And since 2014, he has been MSNBC's election coverage map correspondent. On May 8th, 2017, he was named the national political correspondent for NBC News Group. And that's probably, if you do know Steve, that's probably when you first came to know him, unless you are a true political junkie. Back in 2018, he also published a book titled The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism, which I didn't know until I was like looking more into your background. So now I'm interested in that. And finally, if you are not necessarily a politics person, but you are still listening to this podcast, which we appreciate, you might recognize Steve from Football Night in America, where NBC brought him on back in 2020 to start doing like playoff scenarios, or even if you're into horse racing, he also handicaps the Kentucky Derby now. So big introduction. We are thrilled to have Steve. And Steve, thanks so much for taking a few minutes tonight to talk to us about the midterms.
Happy to do it, Brendan. Good to be with you, you and Ricky, and looking forward to this.
Thank you.
The voice that kind of narrates my election nights, getting to talk to the man in the flesh, it's pretty surreal. I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, I think I omitted like the most notable thing in your bio, which was in 2020, people named you one of the sexiest men alive. So
Yeah, my line on that is that's where the real vote fraud was in 2020.
But needless to say, Ricky and I have not had anybody else on the podcast who was named the sexiest man alive. So first one. So I actually do want to start with just, I gave an overview of your career, but so I want to talk about that a little bit. It feels a little bit like you kind of burst onto the scene a few years ago and we're all of a sudden this like very famous figure. Did it feel that way to you, or did you feel like this was just like a culmination of work you had been doing for 10, 15 years and just now people were starting to recognize that all of a sudden?
Yeah, I guess it was much more like it didn't the stuff that happened in 2020 kind of I guess what was weird. I mean, it was weird to me in a lot of ways, but the fact that it happened kind of in the middle of the pandemic too, probably insulated me from a lot of the things that might have otherwise kind of happened or I might have otherwise noticed, because it was all kind of like a virtual, thing. There weren't too many people like kind of like I'd walk home from the office, and there weren't too many people out in the streets. You weren't going out to restaurants much or bars or anything. So it wasn't like I was out there rubbing shoulders with people and getting any sense that anything had changed kind of. So it was more kind of like an online thing, I guess. And it was even that week, that election week when it kind of happened, it was such a bizarre long week. And I was just so kind of consumed with the election itself. I didn't really, it was more afterwards. People were telling me, go take a look at this, go take a look at that. And I was a little baffled by the whole thing, but, been a couple of years now, and I think things have kind of gotten back to normal. So it was an interesting experience, though, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. But now it does feel like in some ways you've become the guy, like the map guy. People might not even know your name, but it feels like people know who you are.
Yeah, well, I hope. Well, we got an election coming up in about 5-6 weeks here, so I hope that means people will think to tune into us and watch on. I tell folks now it used to be not that long ago election night, and it would be over by midnight or so. It's going to be at least, I think, an election week this year, and it could easily be an election month. So I hope folks will check us out.
Absolutely. So let's get into that. So 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago, it seemed like a red wave was a foregone conclusion. That no longer seems like the case. So what are you seeing as some of the major trends or causes for this reversal of fortune that seems to have occurred over the summer?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of zero in on two things, and I think everybody kind of talks about them. Certainly the abortion decision from the Supreme Court, I do think it had an impact. I think the impact has been in motivating kind of Democratic voters, folks who are already probably aligned with Democrats, but getting them really plugged into the election. I think we'd been showing this in our own polling early this year. We'd been seeing a pretty sizable gap in terms of enthusiasm among Republican voters and Democratic voters. You don't see that in our polling anymore. And I think the other thing is just it's not that Donald Trump went away, but I do think he had receded a bit from kind of the headlines and kind of from the center of the political stage. And I think this summer he kind of reemerged in the center of the political stage because a lot of his candidates were winning some of these really big Republican primaries, and they were winning it, talking about these themes that he talks about when it comes to 2020. So it brought not just Trump back, but it brought all those issues around 2020 back. And then obviously the FBI going into Mar-a-Lago, the saga that kind of kicked off, and we're still kind of living through right now. I think both of those things really brought Trump back to the fore. And I think that's created an element we just haven't seen in midterm elections before, where typically the former president, when the midterm comes around 2 years later, is not front and center in people's minds. I do think there's the possibility right now that Trump is front and center in a lot of voters' minds. And he's just, whatever you think of him, he is an extremely polarizing figure. And that can help Democrats, just again, from the standpoint of people who may not like Biden, may not be too wild about what the Democrats have been doing for the last 2 years, but may also strongly dislike Trump. It's another thing that I think could motivate them to kind of get engaged, and support Democrats. So yeah, I've told people that to me, the range of possible outcomes for November What I would have told you, as you say, 6 months ago, what I would have told you was it goes from a good night to a great night for Republicans. And now I think it's anywhere from like a good night for Democrats, meaning they keep the Senate and maybe on a really good night have a chance of hanging on to the House, to a good night for Republicans where they get the Senate and they get the House with a decent margin. But I think it's now somewhere in there.
So yeah, I saw this headline on Politico the other day where it said, like, is it the Republicans that are actually facing the enthusiasm gap? And I think it's probably for a couple of the reasons that you mentioned, whether the Dobbs decision or President Trump being back in the news. So 538, which is one of my favorite websites, currently has the Democrats keeping control of or extending their advantage in the Senate in like 2/3 of their simulations. Does that feel about right to you? Are you seeing or sensing that same kind of data?
It may seem, my gut, and I'm not going on I don't have my own model to counter with, so I'm giving you the gut feel. The gut feeling is that's a little on the high side. But it really hinges on, to me, a couple of, does Ron Johnson survive in Wisconsin? Because if he doesn't, I think the Democrats are obviously their best position to flip Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's, Pat Toomey, Republican. He's not running for re-election. So this is Fetterman. This is Oz. There's all sorts of indications that Oz is having trouble, kind of connecting with voters there. Fetterman's had his own health issues, but the polling has been pretty encouraging for Democrats and for Fetterman there. So if Democrats get that one, and they could pick up the Wisconsin seat, Ron Johnson's Republican-held seat in Wisconsin, then 67% sounds at least right to me, and probably more. But if Democrats go 1 for 2 in those, then I do think I start to look at it and say, so rank where the Republicans could counter. If Democrats go 1 for 2 in what I just mentioned, Republicans need to pick up a total of 2 somewhere else. And I would say, I think I'd put Georgia at the top of the list still, Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. And I think some of them, again, Walker's had his issues as a candidate, but some of the more recent polling I think has been more encouraging to him. And I think the number 2 spot for Republicans, and it's kind of not gotten maybe the full attention it deserves, is Nevada. And for a variety of reasons, I think Republicans have a very decent shot at Nevada. When you get past that, if they can't win those 2, I think, to me, there's a bit of a line, and then you start looking at the other states, and I think it's the Republicans aren't as well positioned. But I could see a scenario where Johnson hangs on in Wisconsin, and then Walker and Laxalt, the Republican in Nevada, win, and everything else kind of form holds. That would be enough for Republicans, and I that's not, in my mind, that's not that far fetched.
Okay. So yeah, I wanted to dig into some of those. So as people listening probably know, the current Senate is a 50-50 split. To me, it looks like maybe 10, maybe 11 Senate races that are somewhat competitive. You already mentioned a few of them. So assuming the Republicans do lose Pennsylvania in that Fetterman-Oz race, the other 4 that I can see Republicans defending that are toss-ups is Wisconsin, which you just talked about, and then Ohio, North Carolina, and Florida. Do you see any of the Republicans, you talked about Wisconsin a little bit, but for Ohio, North Carolina, and Florida, how vulnerable do you see the Republicans in those states?
Yes, I mean, that's the other wild card. And so if I guess I had to rank them in terms of, in my mind, most vulnerable for Republicans to least, I think of those 3, Florida strikes me as the least vulnerable. Marco Rubio running for re-election there. The main reason is Florida is just this state that, it's always going to be on paper close. The Democrats, I think, are always going to get to that, 47% level or so in Florida, but it keeps breaking to the Republicans. 2014, 2016, 2018, 2020, just the nature of a midterm year, which tends to break against the White House party. That coupled with, I think, DeSantis in the governor's race. I don't expect him to win in a landslide, but I think he's the favorite clearly against Charlie Crist, the Democrat. So I suspect Florida, I'm not expecting it to be by a major margin, but I suspect Florida is the most stable for Republicans. Then I would say Ohio, and Ohio's the one it's a little tricky to read because the polling continues. It's true. When you look at the polling, this is J.D. Vance, the Republican, and Tim Ryan, the Democrat. The polling still has Ryan very much in the game there. And I admit that it's had me wondering. But Ohio, sort of like Florida, but I think more dramatically, is a state that also keeps breaking Republican. And I think especially since the rise of Donald Trump, the swing has been more dramatic in Ohio than it's been in Florida. And we talked about them both 10, 20 years ago as kind of the two premier swing states. We now talk about them as a little bit more Republican friendly. And of the two, I think Ohio is more Republican friendly than Florida is. But the polling there has been very competitive, and it's made me wonder if there's some weaknesses with Vance, some strengths with Ryan. So I have a little more doubt in Ohio, I think, than I do in Florida. And then I think the one that I have the most doubt, to be honest, is North Carolina. And again, the polling there, I think I can't remember who took it. I feel like I just saw one in the last 24, 48 hours that again had it very close. The polling there just has been the closest. And again, could I see a scenario where there's a Democratic surprise there? Probably not. I'd probably bet against it in all three states, but I guess Carolina's the one where I have the most doubt.
You said two things that I'm interested to dive a little deeper into. So one, obviously the Ohio race, JD Vance being, kind of the presumptive Trump-backed candidate. Curious to think, and sort of what you were saying around how Ohio is leaned, particularly since Donald Trump is more in that direction. So it sounds like you're saying that that's probably going to help him. So I won't put words in your mouth. I'll let you answer to that. But then the other sort of thread that I've been picking up on is you keep saying the polling is saying, and that strikes me as there's a healthy dose of skepticism on that. I want to just talk to you about sort of how you feel about polling and like where is it coming short, and why have in so many of the recent elections we kind of gone in thinking one thing or thinking we knew one thing and seeing such a an about face in the actual results.
Yeah, and that actually connects with, I think, one of the reasons why I still suspect Vance will be okay in Ohio, because the polling has been wrong in Ohio and states like Ohio. It's been more wrong in states like Ohio, which is to say they tend to be sort of more of these Midwest, upper Midwest, Rust Belt, whatever you want to define it as, states that have large populations of white voters without college degrees. Demographically, that has been Trump's bread and butter as a group. It's a group that you could go back, say, a generation in our politics, and it was a core Democratic group, and they were blue collar Democrats. And in a lot, they've migrated for all sorts of reasons. It's a fascinating thing toward the Republican Party, and it really accelerated under Trump. And there's all sorts of theories why, but I think there's a compelling case to be made, especially since the rise of Trump, that this type of voter, particularly a Trump-friendly, non-college educated white voter in a state like Ohio, is being missed in the polling, and being missed because they're refusing to participate. Participation levels in polls are just way, way down compared to where they were, let's say, 20 years ago. It's a real issue. And I think there's a real possibility that there's, the pollsters have made all sorts of efforts since 2016, when obviously they were most famously wrong with Trump, have made all sorts of efforts to compensate for what I'm describing here, Trump's demographic strength with non-college white voters. They've made all sorts of efforts to do it. I don't think they figured it out yet. And again, another one of the theories that's out there is that, they are succeeding in connecting with more non-college educated white voters, but they're getting, there's not every non-college educated white voter is a Trump fan, and the efforts the pollsters are making are connecting them with an unrepresentative sample of non-college educated white voters, like the Trump hostile component, the minority of this group of voters. And so that may be throwing the polls too. So it's all a long way of saying we saw it in 16, we saw it in 18 to some degree. We definitely saw it in 20. If you can remember Wisconsin in 2020, there was an ABC poll weeks before the election that had Biden up 17 points in Wisconsin. He ends up winning it by a fraction of a point. So those are the states with those large, older, non-college white populations where they've had the biggest issues with polling. It hasn't been nearly as bad in a state like Georgia, hasn't been nearly as bad in a state like Arizona, but especially when you look at it in Ohio, the results versus the polls, there's been an imbalance there. The polls have been more friendly to Democrats. So it's one of those reasons I look at the Ryan Vance polling, and I'm curious, and I'm wondering, and I guess I wouldn't be shocked if on election night we're looking up and holy cow, Tim Ryan might pull this thing off. But I also wouldn't be shocked at all if we look up on election night and it's like, yeah, this is Trump Biden all over again. We spent 2 months wondering if Ohio was competitive, and it ends up being a pretty solid Republican win.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, Ricky. It's a great question. And I think polling just affects so much because in some ways it's great for those candidates for someone like a Tim Ryan, or who's North Carolina is Sherry, what's her last name? Boost, the Democrat from North Carolina who's running against.
Oh, Beasley. Yeah.
It's great for them because they can start pulling in, they can go to donors and be like, look, these are competitive races. You should be pumping money into this race. I have a real chance of winning. On the other hand, that potentially might be misplaced dollars where donors are investing in Ohio and North Carolina, where they have no shot of actually winning. It's like when people ran against Mitch McConnell or Tim Scott.
Right.
It's like people are throwing millions, tens of millions of dollars into those races that would have been better spent in other races. So I actually want to talk about, we talked about the places where Republicans are defending, those 5 states, the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Florida. But there are 5, in my opinion, states that the Democrats are defending. And you pointed to 2 of them where Georgia and Nevada Democrats are maybe particularly vulnerable. But what do you think of Arizona and New Hampshire as states where Democrats could be vulnerable?
Yeah. New Hampshire to me, it is just seems like the where the Republicans are poised to miss the biggest opportunity. I feel New Hampshire, look, it was presidentially, it was extremely close in 2016, not as much in 2020, but demographically it contains plenty of, the kind of voter I'm describing here, that the Republican / Trump friendly type of voter. Look, Republicans wanted Chris Sununu to be their candidate. Sununu didn't want to run. I suspect if Chris Sununu had run, he'd certainly be very competitive. I think might very well be the favorite. There's all sorts of reasons why he might not have had any interest in running for the seat, but I think missing on getting Chris Sununu in the race and ending up with Bolduc, who's I see he's done this about face on the integrity of the 2020 election after winning the Republican primary. He obviously senses that position was useful in the Republican primary and is potentially costly in the general election. So he's trying to execute a pivot there to the sorts of voters who will decide an election in New Hampshire. I'm not sure how convincing that'll be. If that's going to be a concern for voters, I think he's trying to get away from it, but he's left quite a paper trail there. And that may prove to be a weakness. And in Arizona, it's just it's fascinating to me, the issue of polling accuracy aside. In Arizona, what's interesting is there's a disparity between the polling in the governor's race and the polling in the Senate race. The Republican in the governor's race, Kari Lake, who's Trump aligned, echoes Trump's claims about 2020, Trump endorsed, is leading in some of the polling, or certainly even. And the Republican in the Senate race, Blake Masters, who is also Trump aligned, also Trump endorsed, is trailing in some cases significantly against Mark Kelly, the Democrat. So it's look, Kelly's an incumbent. That may indicate strengths on Kelly's part as an incumbent, but I think it may also indicate some weaknesses on Masters' part as a candidate. And I know there's some disagreements. Republicans nationally, Mitch McConnell, a Senate Republican leader, certainly he felt Masters was a weak candidate. He did not want Masters to be the nominee out there. But Masters has it anyway. And I think there's a disconnect in terms of interest from national Republicans in that race versus some others. That may be a factor as well. But that's where our politics are so nationalized in this day and age. Those are both really good tests of how much candidate quality still matter too.
Right, and luckily Masters has Peter Thiel. He doesn't need the McConnells of the world. But I think to your point, Mark Kelly and Maggie Hassan, I would say probably a lot of the country would see as like pretty solid candidates, particularly for incumbents. So it is interesting to see how much like the national stuff butts up against what are pretty solid records in Congress. And then two other states I wanted to touch on briefly where Republicans hoped to extend the map were Colorado and Washington. Do you see them having any prayers in either of those states?
I've been intrigued by both because I think in each case, Republicans nominated candidates who, if they could get to if the race is competitive, would kind of be potentially compelling to the kinds of swing voters who decide elections in those states, if they can get close enough. O'Day in Colorado, look, Colorado's become a much more democratic state, a much more culturally liberal state over the last, 10, 20 years. It's always had, I think, a tinge of cultural liberalism, but it's just become a much more blue state. And O'Day is very moderate on those cultural issues. And we talking about like Bolduc in New Hampshire having to sort of try to reorient himself for the general election. O'Day doesn't have to do any of that in Colorado. That said, the polling that I've seen has not been encouraging for him. And it's one that as soon as he won the primary, I kind of circled as like, this is a dark horse possibility. To me, it's the kind of race that and it could still materialize. It's where we're a month or so out, but like in a real Republican wave where all these other races we've talked about so far are all breaking kind of Republican, and Republicans are winning the House by a big margin. When you get years like that, and we've had them, Democrats had one in 2018, Republicans had one in 2010, Republicans really had one in 2014 as well. In years like that, when it's a clear wave, you always end up with some surprises on election night that end up real close. And I put Colorado and Washington both in that category, where I think a national Republican wave that seemed very possible 6 months ago would sort of have to rematerialize in the final month of this campaign. But if it did, then I think, the wave pushes everything 5 or 6 points in one party's direction. And if you push both of those states 5 or 6 points in the Republican direction, suddenly I think you'd be looking at competitive races. And I think those candidates could be, I think they nominated in a scenario like that, they nominated good candidates.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the wave or a wave in either direction, because often it's not, specific issue driven. It's more relative discontent with whatever, the direction of the country, and we're all going to kind of go in the other way, right? One thing that I've been noticing just living up here in New England is we're getting hammered with the New Hampshire ads, and all of the ones that are ostensibly pro Maggie Hassan are trying to paint Bolduc as another Republican that's very anti-choice, and like this is the issue that we're going to hammer on. And then in the other direction, Maggie Hassan votes with Joe Biden, causes inflation, and that's what you're going to get, right? Like it, two very almost polar opposite playing fields. I'm curious, we talked a little bit about some of the issues that are galvanizing Democratic voters. What are some of the issues that are specific to states that are playing out across the country that you're tracking, or things that are kind of getting traction from the candidates in terms of what they're looking at and what they're trying to push on in order to get their voters out there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, you with Democrats, it's abortion and Trump. Obviously, with Republicans, it's inflation / the economy, general dissatisfaction with Biden. I mean, that's the other element of this. That like when I try to figure out where things stand, this is why I find myself 5 weeks out in a position I can't remember being in for a midterm election, because if you usually the president's approval rating, tell me the president's approval rating in a midterm election year, and I'll tell you how the midterm election is going to turn out. And Biden's approval rating is right where it is when there's a wave for the other party. He's about 42% on average right now. That's basically where Trump was in 18. It's basically where Obama was in 10. It's, Bush was even lower in 06. It's where Clinton was in 94, the Republican Revolution year. So, you look at Biden's approval rating, and it's exactly where the opposition party wants the president to be heading into a midterm election. But it also usually tracks with the generic ballot, number, which is, in the polling where you ask, would you rather Republicans or Democrats control Congress, or do you want to vote for a Democrat or Republican for Congress? Yes, something like that. The average on the generic ballot right now is essentially tied. I think I checked it this morning. Real Clear Politics, and I saw the Democrats were ahead by 0.3% on the average of all the generic ballot polls. All those years I just mentioned, those midterm wave years where the president had low approval rating, you could also see it in the generic ballot. At this point in 2018, Democrats were way up in the generic ballot. At this point in 2010, not only was Obama way down in approval rating, but Republicans were way up in the generic ballot. They were up in the generic ballot in 2014 as well. This year, you got those two sort of clashing things. So it's Republicans want to ride an anti-Biden message and just basically go with the, vote against the incumbent, vote against Biden, vote against all these Democratic policies. But that generic ballot's making me wonder how effective that is right now, or if there's something that's kind of taking precedence over it. That we also, it's interesting in our polling, the Republicans have a huge issue too on the border. When you ask about the border and when you ask about crime, Republicans have big advantages in our polling on those two issues as well. So I do wonder if that's something you'll hear more of from Republican candidates in the closing stretch. But I guess what ultimately strikes me is I think what would make them, if you talk to Democrats and say what's the best dynamic for you heading into this election, they'll probably tell you they would settle for, if you could give them the same climate that existed on election day in 2020, the same level of the same lines of polarization that existed then, they'd probably settle for that. And remember, in 2020, I mean, look, they walked away with the presidency in both chambers. They lost a bunch of House seats in 2020. Almost lost the House when you look at it, but it was sort of didn't get a lot of attention in the moment because of the presidential race. But to the extent that they can recreate that polarization, which means elevating Donald Trump back to the fore, which means trying to get people to vote against Trump as much as they're voting for Democrats, they would certainly settle for that. And I just, my sense is that's something that at least for these summer months, they succeeded to some measure in doing.
Sure. So now that you've brought up the House, let's move on to it. Going back to 538, their simulations say there's a 7 in 10 chance that Republicans take back the House. And as we mentioned, it seemed a few months back that the Republicans were going to overwhelm in the House and have a huge majority. It doesn't seem like that anymore. For most polls, it seems that it's going to be actually pretty tight majority, that maybe Republicans might end up with 223 to the Democrats 212 or something like that. Is that kind of what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think if you go back in time a year, a little bit less, to the November of last year, you had governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia, and both had 13-point swings from the 2020 election to the 2021 election toward the Republicans, right? Virginia had gone for Biden by 10, then Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, wins the state by 13-point swing. And New Jersey had gone for Biden by 16. Phil Murphy, the Democratic governor, gets reelected, but only by 3 points, 13-point swing toward the Republicans. And I think, and you certainly saw in New Jersey in that election, one of the big factors was the Republican areas of that state were just on fire in terms of turnout. The Democratic areas were just asleep. So you definitely looked at that, and I remember looking at that and trying to extrapolate that to House races all across the country in 2022. And I mean, you can look at Virginia. There's 2 House districts in Virginia that are the 2nd district and the 7th district for folks who really follow these closely. But they've got Democratic incumbents in them who were both elected in the 2018 Democratic wave. And those districts both voted for Glenn Youngkin, pretty solidly in the governor's race last year. So I started looking at those results and saying, look, there's districts like the 2nd and 7th of Virginia all over the country. And I mean, this could be 35, 40 seats for the Republicans based on the climate that seemed to exist in November of 2021. But we've had a number of special House elections this summer, and they've just not followed that path. They've all been, the ones that I'm thinking of at least, have all come after the Supreme Court decision. They've all come as Trump has kind of reemerged, and Democrats have actually, shown you don't see 13-point swings, anything like that in these Houses races we've seen this summer. The most recent one was was in New York State. It was a special election for an open seat, Democratic held, very close district, but the Democrats held it. And that was a big upset that they did, because again, if you were still seeing that Virginia, New Jersey style swing, that would have been a 10-point Republican win. And instead, the Democrats held on to it. So, you still look at the reality of it. The math shows to hold on to the House, especially with the redrawn lines, Democrats have to have just about every break possible go their way. And under that circumstance, they could walk out of election night. You need 218 for a majority. I mean, not election night, but they could walk out of the election with 221, something like that. But yeah, I think that's like the ultimate for Democrats is they just hang on to this thing by a whisker. Whereas for Republicans, they get it by a margin of 10 seats, 20 seats, something like that is more realistic. And that's the other thing for junkies who really follow this, why I say it could be, election week, election month. If you ever get in a situation where the Democrats actually have a chance to hold it, and let's say like hold it, I'm talking like by 3 seats here. If you think about it, where are they going to get those final seats that put them over the top? The Democrats are going to rely on a couple of districts in California and Washington State. If it ever comes to it, that they're trying to get it by that slim of a margin, California and Washington State take a month to count their votes. So that's where we could be waiting on both districts. Yeah,
not that anyone wants that. So
I know.
maybe you. I mean, probably be good for ratings, I guess.
No, I don't want a month. I don't want a month.
Yeah, be not good for your sleep and your relationships probably. So we are, as we're recording this, we are 6 weeks exactly out from election day. What are some of the things that we should be keeping an eye out that could potentially change it, either to go back to that Republican big wave or to a place where Democrats are actually able to keep what they currently have?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm looking at every day is the poll average, and pick your favorite poll average out there, 538 or Real Clear Politics, whatever they are. They all have their own quirky standards or whatever, but you get the idea. And I want to see if I'm watching the generic ballot because I'm assuming Biden's approval rating it's actually gone up a bit over the summer, but like I said, it's still in that zone that like no president wants to be in heading into a midterm election. But the generic ballot is the one I want to see if it moves. One thing technically that is on my mind is we're right now in this transition period where the pollsters basically before Labor Day, when you looked at any poll, it was all registered voters. They would call and include anybody who was a registered voter in the poll. And now after Labor Day, they switched to their models, which means they're trying to determine who the likely voters are. So just being registered to vote is no longer enough to be included in the poll. Now they're trying to figure out the likelihood that somebody's actually going to vote. And you'll see the likely voter model sometimes will shift the generic ballot. They will shift the head-to-head numbers in a race. So we're starting to get those in. One of them this Sunday, I noticed from ABC News, the Washington Post, their poll, there was a pretty significant difference between what they found among registered voters and likely voters in terms of the generic ballot. And the Republicans were doing much better with the likely voters. So in my mind, I'm still at like, let's give this another week or two, let all of these kind of likely voter polls come into these poll averages and see if that shakes it up at all and see if there's a little bit more clarity that comes out of that. If it does, then, if it moves it towards the Republicans, let's say by 2 or 3 points, then I think that right there, you start saying, okay, now that's more in line with not a huge wave, but, a solid night for Republicans. If it doesn't, if we've fully got likely voter models into the mix and we're still looking at, basically a deadlocked generic ballot, even in the face of a pretty low approval rating for Biden, then I'm open to the possibility, we're talking about here of like, hey, this is a district by district battle where Democrats, are underdogs, but it's not impossible that they actually find a way to hold on to the House. So technically speaking, I'm looking for that. The other thing I'm kind of looking at more broadly speaking is just kind of, what's the mix? What's the balance? Let's say late October in terms of what people are absorbing from the news and from the world around them. What's the mix between bad economic news and Trump? And because I really do think that the more when you've got discouraging news about inflation or employment or any of that, it just that is automatically going to be bad for the Democrats. And to the extent that's center stage, that puts Republicans in the position they want to be in politically. To the extent that Trump is at war with a prosecutor, or there's another, whatever it happens to be, something that's put him back in the news. I just think, again, I think that's a win for Democrats, just from the standpoint of it opens up. If you assume that the sort of diehard Trump supporter out there is desperate to get out and vote because can't stand Biden and wants revenge for 2020 and all of that, if you bake that in, the flip side of it is I do think there's a voter out there who's not crazy about Biden and the Democrats, but who does not like Donald Trump. And the more Trump is in the news, I think the more chance Democrats have of getting that voter off the sidelines and into the mix on their side. So that's why I think Trump's prominence in this situation is a net plus for Democrats.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's been really fun kind of getting into like the nitty gritty of almost individual voter mindsets. I wondered, one thing I really wanted to ask you about when I found out you were going to join us. So I feel like in the, especially during the presidential elections in the telestrator sessions, you're kind of really pointing out sort of that rural urban divide when we're getting into sort of states. So obviously we've traditionally just talked about red states and blue states, but come 2016, even highlighted again in 2020, and probably, almost for all time, there's been this real divide in terms of political leanings of the rural voters and urban voters. So this is going to be a little bit of an out there question, but like for somebody who understands the mechanics of how these elections work sort of better than anybody else, do you have an overarching feeling about whether or not they kind of get things right more often than not? Sort of what's your impression of sort of the end result of the election kind of serving the purpose of our democracy? Obviously, it's not just a straight, everybody votes and we kind of pick one thing or the other. We have a very intricate system, and I'm curious, like, how do you feel about it?
I always say that, like, I feel like elections, midterm elections, presidential elections, are like the family photo of America. So your presidential election, you're taking one every 4 years, and you're getting a glimpse of the family at that moment. And then you take another 4 years later, and you can look at the picture, and you can compare the two, and you can see how it's changed, who's come in, who's left, who's changed their appearance, and you could get a whole series of them across time, and you can start to, just from the pictures, you can start to tell a story. And I kind of feel that's what elections are like, especially, with a national election where you've got red-blue maps for states, or then you could break it down a level further and you've got red-blue maps for counties, congressional districts, that sort of thing. I think you can start to tell a story. And I mean, there are fascinating stories there. Looking at presidential elections, some of the most sort of core, staunchly Democratic, or what, if you're painting the maps now, blue areas of the country, say, a generation ago, maybe the 80s into the 90s with Bill Clinton, would have been in Appalachia, would have been in Kentucky and in West Virginia. I mean, Michael Dukakis, we'll get a mass reference in here. Michael Dukakis, one of the most, lost in a landslide nationally, very liberal candidate, but he won West Virginia, and this is 1988. And you fast forward to 2016 and 2020, and Donald Trump is winning West Virginia by 40 points. That's how much the politics culturally, I don't think West Virginia's changed that much. It's not like there's been this huge influx of, it's still a lot of native born Appalachian West Virginians, and they have realigned themselves politically, just dramatically. Vermont, look at the flip side of it. Vermont in 1988 voted for George Bush Sr. I think Bush Sr. won nationally by about 8 points in 88. I think his Vermont margin might have been 6. It was only slightly Vermont, slightly to the right, to the left of the country as a whole. And now Vermont's one of the most liberal, Democratic blue states, deepest blue states in the country. So again, when you look at these maps across time, you see those shifts, you see those changes. And there's always stories behind them, and it's fun to kind of learn the stories behind them and to try to figure out, what is it? I mean, it's this divide, yeah, urban, rural, or like I said, it's there's a among white voters, there's certainly this divide, college, non-college, what goes into that, what drives that. The new and emerging one that I'm really interested in seeing how it plays out this year is among Hispanic voters. Significant shift away from the Democrats toward Republicans in 2020 that defied a lot of people's assumptions. And I really want to see what that looks like in 2022. That could be decisive in Nevada in that Senate race. There's a couple of congressional districts right along the border in deep South Texas that are just what I was describing. I mean, that were like voted for Hillary Clinton by counties that voted for Hillary Clinton by 50, 60 points in 2016 that were competitive by 2020. I mean, that big of a change in just 4 years' time. What do they look like in 2022? What's the reason for that? What's going on there? So I love looking at these maps and these sort of data sets, seeing how they change and then trying to understand why.
I love like your passion. Ricky and I are just like smiling, listening to it. It's like, this is why people like watching you. So we appreciate your time here, Steve. If 6 weeks out, so we're not going to hold you to this, but if tonight we asked you to make a prediction, what do you got on election night?
Well, safest prediction is I don't think it'll be settled election night. Certainly not the Senate, because if you look at the states that are going to decide it, it's at Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. The first, go back to 2020, the first one of those states to be called, at least by my network, wasn't until the Saturday after the election, and that was Pennsylvania. So if you have at all close races in those states, they have not changed substantially the way they count the votes. It's going to be a long, slow, days-long count in those states. The other possibility there, too, by the way, is you could get into a situation where Republicans have 50 seats, Democrats have 49, and Georgia goes to a runoff just like it did in 2020, because there's a libertarian who's going to get 3% of the vote, and it could be 49, 48, and then they go to a runoff. The runoff would be December 6th this year. You could have the exact same thing you had in 2020, which is a Georgia runoff that decides control of the Senate. So that's not impossible either. So my like a chicken way of getting out of a prediction is to predict we won't know that night. But I look, right now I would say that the Republicans are definitely favored to take the House. I would be surprised if the Democrats held on. I would also be surprised if the Republicans retook it by a really massive margin. I just, in my mind, the range is somewhere from like a Democratic majority of 5 seats to a Republican majority, of 25, 30, some 25, let's say, somewhere in there. I think that's where it is in my mind as a range. And the Senate side, yeah, you asked me earlier about the 67% from 538. In my gut, it's closer to 50-50. And honestly, it's just one of those on any given day, I feel a little bit differently. I think I've been a little bit more toward the Republican side because I've been looking at Nevada more and more and thinking the Republicans may be better positioned there than I had been kind of factoring in.
All right. So we got a prediction. We appreciate that. I don't envy people in Georgia at all over these last few years. It just feels like nonstop election stuff for them. That must be exhausting.
It's, one problem Massachusetts never has, right?
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, I don't love that either, but yeah, I guess it's always grass is always greener type situation. But again, thank you so much, Steve. If you want to check them out, you can check them out on NBC or the NBC networks for these next 6 weeks. And as he said, probably longer than the next 6 weeks on the election coverage. And go check out his book that he published back in 2018 as well. So plenty of ways you can consume Steve Kornacki content. But thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a blast, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We were just saying that's what a treat that was. It was I said it to him, but I am fired up. I love when our guests, it was the same one we had Dan Fishman on, and I just love when our guests are so passionate about this stuff, and it's not just like this persona he puts on television. Like he truly is like fired up to talk about these district by district races and like the registered voters versus likely voters and the rural urban divide you were asking about. And so yeah, I'm happy and fired up just having talked to him.
Yeah, he definitely like lives and breathes this stuff, and I think you can sort of tell when there's a journalist who's talking about something that like keeps them up at night, and they're like trying to research these different esoteric connections, and like he can really do that. And yeah, it was definitely a treat for us to get to experience that in person and get to interject and add some questions in here and there.
For sure. And these next 6 weeks will obviously be fascinating. I think this is the time of year where, like, as he said, if you're like a real junkie, you've been following this stuff for probably close to a year of making these predictions. But for the average voter who have like real things going on in their lives, these are the 6 weeks where you start to pay attention to these things. You're starting to see the ads on television. You're starting to maybe do some research online. And so while the polls have told us a lot and give us a pretty good idea of like the range of outcomes right now, there's still so much that can change over these next 6 weeks. And certainly it'll be fascinating because, as you and I know, like things change so quickly. Like you don't know what's going to happen. As Steve said, there could be another Trump thing that rears its head. The economy is starting to, like, the stock market has been down in the last week. If inflation continues to rise, if the unemployment rate starts to rise, all of a sudden we could start to have that more of the smaller red wave, at least, that happens. But on the other hand, if gas prices continue to fall, if food prices maybe start to go down a little bit, if we do have these Republican candidates not being able to pivot more to the center, you could have what seemed unfathomable a few months ago, that Democrats have a pretty solid night. So there's still a ton to watch for over the next few months.
Yeah, I think one thing that was interesting for me was that in these sort of red wave or blue wave situations, it's almost a little bit less about the candidates themselves and more about sort of general perception. And that in this instance, it's both about the candidates themselves, but also about a general discontentment with either the way that the country is headed or Biden specifically, which is, I think that's like a fascinating dynamic to play out, in that people are being forced to look a little bit more closely as to like who they might be voting for, whether based on specific issues, as well as like, okay, but do I want a Congress that's dominated by Republicans or Democrats, or do I want a Senate that's going to be making some laws for me now, in a way that maybe those direct connections hadn't really been made before.
Sure. And I think it's increased not only to like the polarization, the national, where all races seem to be national now, which seems to be more of a thing in recent years, that Steve was saying, but also that it is really close. I mean, so like New Hampshire isn't just electing this one person. They're electing someone that like really could swing the balance of power in the country and affect the laws for a lot of people in this country. And so it doesn't feel like exaggeration to say that like this race could determine control of the Senate, because as we mentioned, a lot of them really could. And there are 10 different states out there that might be energizing their voters along that message. And the cynical side of me is like, I don't love where Steve was kind of getting at it, like the voter that says, I don't love Biden and the direction that the Democrats are really taking the country right now. But if the alternative is a bunch of like Trumpists in power, I like that less. This is the naive optimist in me. You wish that people were voting because they were excited about where the Democrats have taken us over the last 2 years, or on the alternative, you think that the Republicans have a far better vision for the country that you want to see.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I think, it goes back a little bit to what I was saying during the Dobbs decision, that like, I think you would have seen, there is more of like a fear of the other side getting their way than there is of like a hope that my side will get their way, because in so many ways we don't even really know like what the kind of what the priorities and what the positions will be. Like the races are very much being run in the negative, like what will happen if the other side.
Yeah, which I hate, but I think it will be, and you are getting at this question where it's just going to be a battle of narratives now, because as we've started to see, and we talked about this last week with the DeSantis stunt, what do the Republicans want to get in the news? They want immigration, they want crime, they want the economy, they want all of those things in the news. And what do Democrats want in the news? They want abortion, they want voting rights, they want climate change in the news. And it's who's going to win the battle of narratives, right? If ultimately when you're going into the poll, the thing you care most about is the economy, that's going to be good for the Republicans. They've won that battle. On the other hand, if you're most concerned about abortion rights or voting rights or climate change, that's going to be much more like, that's great for the Democrats. And so I think both parties do have messages to deliver. It's really which ones are able to do it more effectively.
Yeah. One thing I was surprised that didn't really come up is Russia, Ukraine. So like foreign policy, which we always talk about, is like
no one cares.
No one cares about, but is actually the one area that really Congress, the Senate, and the office of the presidency have like the most direct control over. That really, like, we turn that over to them, and then we don't do anything about it after that. Like, we have no say in the matter. And, for many of these hot button issues, you talk about the supply chain problems and inflation, like a lot of contributing factors have to do with the ongoing conflict between, in Ukraine, talking about climate change, even like if progressives are serious about that, we have to be able to engage with Russia and China, which we're doing less and less of, right? Like, so there are the political parties are doing a very good job of focusing the issues. But in terms of like talking about, like, in terms of saying one side cares, the other side doesn't, but in terms of like talking about solutions and how we would actually fix it, the fact that Russia, Ukraine doesn't come up at all is kind of ridiculous, but very emblematic and like, not surprising in terms of the way that we have to, the way that we operate our elections.
Yeah, not ideal, but ultimately this is like the classic, this is the trade-off. Like you need to get in power to make the decisions. And so it's right now, these next 6 weeks are all about getting into power.
Right.
We'll figure things.
I mean, which, two of those things that he alluded to as well, like, with Bolduc trying to, first framing himself as like pro-Trump, like questioning the legitimacy of the election. Now he's in the general, and now he's got to like unquestion the legitimacy of the election to kind of get those centrist-ish, whatever conservatives or more moderate conservatives. And similarly, we've talked about the issue of Democrats like kind of pouring money into Trump back candidates to try and elevate Trump to the fore, exactly for the reasons that Steve was mentioning, that like this is a more or less a winning issue, or at least a distraction from some of the other things that are going on. It's very interesting how quickly it feels like people are willing to sort of sell their souls for a seat at the table.
Sure. It's one, like I said earlier, it's the wide-eyed optimist in me is like, oh, I wish that they wouldn't do that. And if I was in that position, I would never do that. But that's why I'm sitting on the sidelines commenting on people that are actually doing the work and the reality of the situation. But like I said, 6 weeks out, it'll be, our eyes will all be glued to it. I'm sure you and I will talk much more about this over the next 6 weeks and past then, as Steve was saying. But this will serve as our big midterm marker episode.
Indeed.
And quite honestly, I don't know that it could have been a better one. So hopefully people enjoyed, Steve. We certainly did. That was a true pleasure.
Indeed. All right, man. Till next time.
Listen.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.